Okay, great. Welcome, welcome. So today we're going to be talking about the causes of fatigue and the four-step process to resolving them. So first off, congratulations. Every time you take another step in this process, you're going to get better and better, and you're committing to getting better, which I really want to applaud you for. So we're going to talk today about my story of fatigue, the causes of fatigue that I had, and how it led me to learning about all of the causes of fatigue and then the four steps to resolving fatigue. So here's my story. So when I first entered residency, I was just coming off of a yoga meditation retreat, actually a yoga teacher training at Kripalu in Western Massachusetts. That's me on the left there, 2004. I had been traveling. I went to Australia and New Zealand, and I was just having just a wonderful time with life. And then I entered residency, came out to Western Washington. That's me actually with a bunch of acupuncture needles, I believe, coming out of my ears. Some of the electives that I had done fourth year of medical school. I think that was at the UCLA Center for East-West Medicine. But I started my residency in family medicine through the University of Washington's program in Olympia, Washington. So about a month in, I met my amazing wife-to-be, Stacy, here on the right, and we fell in love. And unfortunately, about 3 months later, she had chronic fatigue. She had a really hard time getting out of bed. She went from practitioner to practitioner until finally she found a naturopath who would run an adrenal stress index on her, and her cortisol pretty much had flatlined. And I was in residency. I was learning all this stuff about conventional medicine, and I couldn't help her. I felt completely powerless. And I asked everybody that I could, all of my attendings and specialists, about fatigue, and nobody really had any answers. We'll kind of get into in a little bit about what conventional medicine has to offer in terms of fatigue, but they really couldn't. I would come home, I didn't have much time to do some research, and I didn't really get anywhere. Fortunately, she got better after about 3 years. And so in 2006, we got married. 2007, I graduated from residency after 3 years in residency. And then 2008, started a practice and had a child. And Stacy was just coming out of her fatigue. And then I went into my fatigue. So it was kind of like a bathtub that was, slowly being filled. Felt like I was, swimming, trying to just barely keep my head above water. My brain fog got so bad that I could barely remember the person in front of me. Now, fortunately, I was able to focus on them long enough to practice good medicine. But once they were out of that chair, thank goodness I had an electronic medical record because I couldn't remember anything about them. And that was really challenging. I had to hire other practitioners to come on board to cover the overhead. I had staff at that time. I had the cost of the building, the rent, lots of costs. And so I had to bring on somebody else because I could only work a couple hours a day. And then I had to lie down. And I really couldn't function at home. I couldn't help out my wife, which really pushed my buttons on guilt and shame. I felt awful about myself. I couldn't play. I couldn't help out with my new daughter. So I was really struggling, and that went on for 5 years. And so my quest to finding the causes of my fatigue, where I started off in conventional medicine, I got board certified, and I was looking at the conventional causes of fatigue, which really are just thyroid. There are some other ones, more severe ones, like hepatitis, lung problems, liver problems, heart problems, but nothing of the kind of chronic fatigue nature that is more common and less severe. I then learned about integrative medicine. I got board certified in it, and I learned about how to replace any sort of deficiencies that were present. So nutrients, hormones. I learned a lot about lifestyle, a lot about the importance of food, eating the right foods, removing the bad foods, food toxins. And then I learned about functional medicine. So basically a biochemical look at individuals. So what is an individual's biochemistry? How are they different from this person over here? And what are the areas of imbalance? Inflammation, immune system, looking more at areas of imbalance as opposed to just like a one size fits all, and looking more at individualizing medicine. And it was this new paradigm that was really exciting. And then what functional medicine couldn't teach me, didn't have to offer, I went and learned from environmental medicine. And I learned more about the toxicities, heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and infections that we'll get into in a little bit. So top of the screen is what we used to think, the old paradigm, kind of just labeling things. And then the new paradigm is the bottom, is the roots. What are the root causes? You're never going to go wrong if you're always looking for the root causes and always asking, well, what's the cause of that? And what's the cause of that? And what's the cause of that? So saying that diabetes is the cause of, somebody's symptoms is just the first step. The next step is, what is the cause of the diabetes? And then what's the cause of that? And then what's the cause of that? So kind of moving down that until you really get to the root causes of these problems. So, and what I found were the real causes of fatigue, which can be grouped into two groups: deficiencies and toxicities. So for deficiencies, I found that there were nutrient deficiencies, which included vitamins like vitamin D, B12, other B vitamins, minerals like magnesium, iron, selenium. I learned about hormonal deficiencies, so the adrenals, thyroid, sex hormones, sleep issues, sleep deficiencies. So if people aren't getting enough sleep, they're not getting good quality of sleep, they're snoring or they have sleep apnea, having a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep. People who had a lack of or an excess of movement or exercise. So for a lot of my patients, they are not able to exercise because of their fatigue. And there are and sometimes people get fatigue from having excess exercise. Okay. So sometimes I find that, people they read online that if they have fatigue, they just need to exercise harder. And all that does is drain their adrenals. But then there are people who are more sedentary who need to exercise more. Dehydration. So most of us are walking around dehydrated, not drinking enough water. Deficiency in water. Deficiency in organic food. There's the nutrients that are going to come from the food, the quality of the food, the antioxidants, the energy of the food. We'll talk more about food toxins or food allergies when we get to the toxicities. Then mitochondria. So the energy center of every cell in the body, except for red blood cells, is the mitochondria. It produces about 70% of our ATP or our energy. And so incredibly important and can be damaged by a lot of the toxicities we're going to talk about. Heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, allergies. And once it is damaged, you have to remove the toxicities, but you also have to rebuild the mitochondria. Fatty acids or cell repair, this goes along kind of with mitochondria, but there is a cell membrane that exists around every single cell in the body. There's over 100 trillion of them, and those cells are responsible for communication. So oftentimes when we have memory issues or brain fog, we don't have good cell-to-cell communication or outside of cell to inside of cell communication. And that all has to do with this lipophilic membrane, this membrane that's made up of fats. So very important. Also important to remember that 60% of the brain is fat. So we have to get the good fats in and in the right ratios. And then neurotransmitter deficiencies like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA. So, and then the other group is the toxicities. So this is the heavy metals. So there are 100,000 pounds, well, over 100,000 pounds at this stage, of mercury that's dumped into the oceans every single year by coal plants. Okay, and now we have found that every single thing that comes out of the oceans, all marine life, has some mercury in it. So very toxic and a huge problem. There are 84,000 chemicals that we're exposed to on a regular basis that haven't been necessarily evaluated appropriately by the FDA. And these are cosmetics, these are household products, and then electromagnetic frequencies. So everything that has a battery, we can disrupt our DNA. You know, we're talking, a lot of people are talking about 5G coming to their areas, and that I think would be catastrophic, because we're finding that the more toxicities that people have, the more they're affected by these electromagnetic frequencies. I have some clients who drive down the road, and if they can tell, because they get neuropathy in their feet, if they're getting close to a cell tower or a power plant station. So very toxic, and a big part of fatigue causes. And then with molds, about half of the buildings in the modern world are water damaged, and most of those have mold. Okay, so this is a huge problem. You know, if you, like, I drive around my town, and because people will say, well, what about a new home versus an old home? You know, most people, first off, don't realize that they have had mold exposure. They don't realize what causes it. So I tell people, you know, what about, you know, have you ever had a flood in your home or a leaky roof? And oftentimes they'll say no, and then they come back later and they say yes. But you know, sometimes it's nothing that you ever experienced, where I'm driving down the road and I see a home that's being built in the middle of a rainstorm. And what they're going to do is they're going to build that, and then when it dries, they're going to zip it all up and make it all tight, and that wet wood is already has mold growing on it, and all you have to do is add some heat, decrease the airflow, and all of a sudden there's mold in those homes. So mold is a big issue. And then different kinds of infections. So there's intestinal infections, bacteria and yeast, blood and stealth infections like Lyme and Lyme co-infections, sinus infections like MARCoNS and others, dental infections like root canals, and parasitic infections, which can be anywhere in the body. And then allergies. So there can be food allergies, there can be inhaled allergies, and these can really, you know, they disrupt foods. You consume them. There's 80% of the immune system in the gut, and the immune system is just going to react to these things. So negative emotions. So the way that we look at the world, our mindset, as well as ACEs, or adverse childhood events. You know, things that we grow up with, emotional traumas that we have, will cause chronic stress on the body and contribute to fatigue. Unfortunately, we have Stacy to help us and kind of go through some of these processes to reset our immune systems and work on this. Constipation. We'll talk about my story with constipation in just a minute. And then other causes, like I talked about, heart disease, lung disease, sinus congestion, cancers, hepatitis, all things that can be ruled out by your primary care physician. And we will not focus on those in this course, but it is important to have those evaluated to rule them out. So what were the causes of my fatigue? So I had nutritional deficiencies. I was low in iron, B12, folate, magnesium. I had mitochondrial issues, fatty acid issues. I had adrenal issues, thyroid deficiency, testosterone deficiency. And then my sleep wasn't good because I was going through residency. So oftentimes we had to be up for 36 hours at a time. I wasn't moving going through residency. I wasn't exercising regularly, and I was chronically dehydrated. And then the toxicities that I had were mercury. I had mercury fillings from an early age, and I grew up loving tuna fish. I had tuna fish probably 3 times a week for most of my life. And the bigger the fish, the more fat it has, the more mercury it has in it. So swordfish and tuna is really at the top. Sardines and anchovies are at the bottom. So formaldehyde and plastic toxicity. So when I went to medical school in anatomy class, we had bodies that were preserved in formaldehyde, and I had an exposure for that when I tested for it. And then drinking out of plastic water bottles. I had a lot of plastics in my system. Mold toxicity. So from a home that I lived in medical school, as well as homes that I lived in Washington State. And then I had Epstein-Barr virus, Bartonella, yeast, parasites. I had food allergies of gluten, dairy, and some really interesting ones like cashews and ginger. And then I was chronically constipated growing up, which was a big part of my issue. I thought it was normal to have a bowel movement once a week. Nobody ever told me otherwise until I learned later in life, and there was already a lot of damage done. Because if you're constipated, you're not excreting your toxins, and all I was doing was recirculating those toxins that were trying to get out of my body. They just got reabsorbed. And then emotions, negative self-talk, and some of the adverse childhood events that I had. So that was my story. I had pretty much almost every cause of fatigue, and I suffered for 5 years. And what I found that I would get a little bit better with every cause that I found and that I treated, but it was only after finding all of the causes and treating them that I really found resolution. And I found that there's this cumulative effect to healing multiple causes. I tell people that there's 20 nails in the bottom of your foot, and we have to remove a significant amount of those nails before you notice a difference. We have to remove the adrenal deficiency and the thyroid deficiency and the mold and the Lyme, in order for people to really start to notice a big shift. Now, my goal is always to have steady incremental improvement, and oftentimes that is the case, but usually there's a cumulative effect where you get enough of those out and there's a huge jump in the energy. And this is what I see over and over again in my clients. And so that's why I created the Fix Your Fatigue program. And as you guys know, it helped me get my energy back. I've helped lots of people, and I'm trying to get the word out so that I can achieve my mission of helping 1 million people resolve their fatigue. So the Fix Your Fatigue program is a 4-step process to resolving fatigue. And the first step is to assess, okay? And this is to assess all of the causes. So we need to figure out all of the causes, because the sooner we do that, the faster you get better. Because if we just say, okay, you've got adrenal problems, let's work on that, for the next 6 months, and then say, okay, now we're going to look and do some testing to determine if you've got mold in your body. That's one way to have a long relationship with a practitioner. The faster that we can get all of these causes taken care of initially or assessed initially, the faster we can address them. And we're going to combine all of the information that we have. Your history, the chronology of that history, what were some of the triggering elements, what are the symptoms you have now, and then what do the lab tests say? And we'll look at all of those deficiencies we talked about and all of the toxicities. And then, just makes sense, we're going to start fixing those deficiencies and toxicities. We start off by fixing the deficiencies. Okay, my goal is always to make people as strong as possible, as soon as possible. And in order to remove the toxicities, we have to start by replacing the deficiencies. And once we've started on the path of replacing the deficiencies, adrenals, thyroid, sex hormones, nutrients, getting them nice and strong, that's when we really start opening up the detoxification process. Sometimes we do them at the same time, depending on the individual, but this is going to be really helpful in setting us up for the next step, which is to remove all of the toxicities. So this is going to be our roadmap coming up. So we're going to talk about how to assess all of the causes using labs. That's going to be in a subsequent video. We're going to talk about how to do it with symptoms as well. And we're going to talk about, what are the benefits to getting labs first versus as we go. And whatever you decide is fine. And you're going to find out which I recommend and I prefer. You kind of already have an idea, I'm sure. But it's fine whichever one you want. We just want to make sure that they happen as soon as possible so that you can get all the data and we can address all of the causes. And then we're going to talk about replacing the deficiencies, how to test for them, and what to take for each deficiency. And like I said, it's going to be cumulative. Every single one of these deficiencies that we address, you're going to start to feel better and better. Then we're going to open up the detoxification pathways. in the bowels, in the liver, in the kidneys, in the lymphatics, in the brain lymphatics. So I basically see the body as like this big tube with these little tubes inside of it, working from the bottom up. And so we want to make sure that you're stooling to get everything out. We want to make sure liver and kidneys are then on top of that, dumping into the stool if needed, or going out of the body in urine. Then the lymph is dumping into the liver and kidneys, and then the brain lymph is dumping into the body lymph. And then removing all of the toxicities. You know, how to test for each one of them, what to take in order to remove them, and then what order to remove them, which is also really important. All right, so that's it for today. So go ahead and shut this down for now, and we'll see you in the next video.